And when I would be back at my apartment alone and thinking about the way the day had gone, or the way I thought I was perceived, or the opportunities I did or did not get, or just my overall performance, or how I felt I was progressing within the company, all of these things that would come up around being in this very new situation and a high pressure and at times high stress situation, and not wanting to cope with those heavy emotions, I would often turn to food. Hi dancers, Jess Spinner here. Welcome back to the Whole Dancer YouTube channel. Today I'm going to dive into emotional eating and the impact that it can have on dancers. And emotional eating is something that I connect to quite closely, as it's something I really struggled with for many years, especially in my primary professional dancing years. So if you're there, if you're going through emotional eating, or you consider yourself an emotional eater, or you just feel like you turn to food in times of struggle, first I just want to say I totally understand what you're going through and I fully relate to that situation. There's a question that comes up whenever I talk about emotional eating in relation to dancers, that is, are dancers more susceptible to emotional eating? From what I have seen, there haven't been any studies specifically done on dancers and increased incidence of emotional eating. There are studies on dancers and eating disorders, and there is a higher level of incidence within the dance population for eating disorders. And since emotional eating can fall within disordered eating realm, perhaps there is also an increased level of emotional eating amongst dancers. One of the theories that's connected to emotional eating, restraint theory. And within this, it says that when people have too many food rules or regulations or, dieting tenets that they're trying to follow, there is a greater likelihood that in times of emotional distress, they will abandon all of their rules and overeat or indulge in things they might not typically eat, and just sort of abandon again and lose all of those strict rules. When you consider the connection between restraint theory and emotional eating, and then also consider how many dancers tend to get into a place of having very strict food rules and regulations for yourself, it is definitely possible that dancers have a higher level of emotional eating. Simply put, emotional eating is a tendency to turn to food in times of strong or high emotions or emotional distress. Now, in the conversation of emotional eating, you'll hear a lot of people now talking about how emotional eating is okay and it's normal and it's part of our lives. When that's being discussed, because it is okay in some instances, it has to be within the context of, emotional eating at events or for birthdays, or emotional eating at parties and things like that, where there's positive things going on. And so you're making these choices to eat things, even if perhaps you're not like super hungry for them, or, you don't necessarily need it at that moment for fuel, but you're making these choices based on being in a positive and happy and celebratory, perhaps, frame of mind, right? That's one kind of emotional eating. And there's also the emotional eating where you are feeling down or sad, right? You're dealing with distressing or heavy emotions, and you make a conscious choice to say, right now, I want to have some ice cream because that makes me feel better when I'm feeling sad. And you make that conscious choice, and it's not an out of control experience. You feel very much like you're still tuning into your body and you're not going past point of comfort and all of that. So these are emotional eating incidents that may fall within your balanced relationship to food, which is something we talk about a lot at the Whole Dancer. I want your goal to be to achieve balance within the realm of food and body image, and that takes time and effort and considerations like this. So that kind of emotional eating really can be okay. Emotional eating that is challenging and distressing, and really for dancers creates all kinds of mental struggles surrounding the impact that it might have on your body and ability to dance your best and dance professionally and achieve your goals in dance and all of that. Like, the emotional eating that is in response to emotions and becomes very out of control, and you are not present in that situation, and you are not making mindful choices based on your needs or desires. That's the emotional eating that I'm talking about, that really should be given full attention and should be considered to go and move through it is probably going to be part of your journey in achieving your personal best for dance. And so I did want to share just a little bit more of my personal emotional eating journey and how I see this with dancers as well. But I'll talk about contributing factors, things that really can lead dancers to emotional overeating in the same way that I experienced it. So I would say the most sort of prominent memories of emotional eating for me were within my first few years of dancing professionally. And I think, again, this is a time when it can be somewhat more common. And some of the things that contributed to my own experience at that time were I was living alone, at least in my first year. My second year, I had a roommate, but she would often be away on weekends. So again, I still had a lot of alone time. And when I would be back at my apartment alone and thinking about the way the day had gone, or the way I thought I was perceived, or the opportunities I did or did not get, or just my overall performance, or how I felt I was progressing within the company. All of these things that would come up around being in this very new situation and a high pressure and at times high stress situation, and not wanting to cope with those heavy emotions, I would often turn to food. For me, and from what I see with many dancers, a big compounding factor here was that throughout most days, I was not adequately fueling. So I would try to eat perfectly and less than what my body needed at breakfast and lunch and snacks during the day. Those things would not be sufficient for the amount of dancing I was doing, for being at the studio from, company class at 9:30 or 9:45 until 5 o'clock at night rehearsing. I was not adequately fueling. So then when I would get home and be faced with these distressing emotions, there was a major hunger factor there as well. And this was a hunger not just for actual food and fuel and nourishment in that way, but this was also a hunger for some sort of comfort and, a way to perhaps find joy within different foods or flavors. And, a lot of times we're drawn to very high sugar, high carb, those kinds of foods in these times. And that was what I would gravitate towards when I was experiencing emotional distress. It was a pattern and one that I really struggled to get out of. And my most common response to emotionally overeating at night would then be to say, well, that means I have to eat less tomorrow, or I have to undereat at breakfast, or I should have very little breakfast. But it was a cycle for me. And for so many dancers, I see this very common cycle. And if there's an emotional component, it can be just that much more challenging to get out of. I continued to use food in that way throughout my dance journey. My weight fluctuated significantly throughout my dance journey. Emotional overeating was a big part of those fluctuations. It never really got to a place where I was consistently fueling my body and then also taking the steps to manage and cope with my emotions in ways without food. And this is a big thing that I work with dancers on now, is making sure that you have a very whole life and a well-rounded life and life experience and approach to your dancing. I know that it can really help with any emotional eating struggles you might also be facing. Some other contributing factors that are worth considering if you find that you're emotionally eating, or you find that you turn to food in times of heavy emotions. And I just want you to start thinking about them and think about what the impact of these different things might be for you, and if any of them need some particular attention. The first one is your individual experiences in relationship to food. And so for some of us, different foods have very comforting effects. Maybe mac and cheese is something that as a little kid you would eat with your dad when he was home for the weekend, and he traveled or worked a lot during the week, and this was a special time that you had. So now mac and cheese could become a food for you that you turn to when you want that sort of comfort or you're craving connection. And so it's very valuable to identify what these sort of food associations you have with emotion are, so that you can start to just be intentional with them. It's not saying that you'll stop eating mac and cheese altogether, but you might decide to eat mac and cheese at very specific times rather than it being a less conscious choice. For dancers, like I mentioned, a big factor in potential to emotionally eat could be underfueling or undernourishing. And this really might take some very close attention, because I think a lot of dancers have seen a very normalized and restrictive approach to food in their dance community and amongst their dance peers. So it's going to take looking at this and being really honest with yourself and trying out simply adding food earlier in the day. If you're someone like who has a similar experience to what I had, where I would emotionally eat at night, be very intentional and bulk up those meals earlier in the day. Now, you may still have to adjust your approach to the nighttime and emotions and coping. Good action step could be adding in some food earlier in the day and seeing what the impact is on your tendency to turn towards food in those challenging times. Consider the impact of the people around you and your relationships. Like I said as well, when I was living alone, a factor for me was the fact that I didn't have these relationships around much of the time, and I didn't have that connection or people to talk to when I was struggling with the stress of my first professional job. But there are also factors where, you'll go out to dinner, and depending on whom you're with, you may eat more or you may eat less, or you may make certain food choices, eating healthier or less healthy, depending on who you're with. You're going to consider those things, consider what your mindset is surrounding those choices, and for this one, I would say just start to commit to tuning into your own needs and desires and try to work against what those external factors might be for you. Next one is your coping mechanisms. If you are dealing with any stress or heavy emotions on any sort of regular basis, like I said, especially if maybe you're in a new pre-professional program, you're just starting out there, or you're getting into your first company job, or you have life situations going on that are creating stress for you, what are the ways that you're coping with those situations? Do you have people who you turn to for support? Do you have friends that you turn to have conversations when you're struggling? Are you comfortable opening up to people about the stresses that you face? Do you have journaling as one of your coping mechanisms? Do you read books that really help you get into a more calm mentality? Or do you listen to podcasts? Do you go for a walk? Do you do these different things? Do you find ways to soothe yourself and soothe these heavy emotions outside of food, right? Food can sometimes be a part of it. It's not all bad if it's an intentional choice, but do you have other ways to cope with emotions? And then another factor that can impact your potential to turn to food for comfort and to engage in emotional eating is your sleep schedule. How many times could I talk about sleep? A million. We'll see how many times I hit. But when you're not getting enough sleep, it has such a big impact on your hormones. It has such a big impact on your ability to cope with stress and to find, even if you have these alternative coping mechanisms right outside of food, if you are sleep deprived, it is going to be hard to come up with them. You're just going to struggle to actually get there, and the food thing might be easiest for you. So really prioritize sleep in order to better manage your emotions and stresses in dance and in life. So dancers, emotional eating, like I said, it was a big part of my journey. It was a big struggle for me, and it's something I've seen in varying levels with many of the dancers whom I've worked with over the years. So I have just released an emotional eating exploration course called Find Food Harmony, and I think that dancers especially should consider what their relationship to food is. What's your emotional relationship to food? Through the course, I'll talk more about contributing factors, but a big element and aspect of the course is going to be providing you with resources in order to start working through any emotional eating habits that you find come into your life on a more regular basis. You have the ability to start to uncover a lot. It's so much about self-reflection, so much about being intentional with food. But you can find confidence in your food choices, find confidence in your emotional relationship to food. And that's what I hope to give you in this brand new course, Find Food Harmony. I will link to it below. But if you have any questions and you're interested in signing up, just shoot me an email, jess@thewholedancer.com. Thank you all so much again for tuning in for today's video, and we'll catch you next time. Bye, guys.